The Ukraine war is about to go into overdrive. For weeks, Donald Trump believed he had Vladimir Putin right where he wanted him. The US was convinced that Russia was on board for ceasefire talks. That peace was finally within reach, and Trump could walk away as the deal-maker who ended the Ukraine war. Then, in an instant, everything fell apart. Russia didn't just say no to a ceasefire. Putin humiliated Trump, blindsided him with a total rejection of peace talks. Now, Trump isn't just scrambling, he's been betrayed. Maybe the US should have seen this coming. Today we break down why Putin chose now to turn on Trump, what this means for the war in Ukraine, and the big question no one wants to ask: what happens next? But first, some context. On February 13, 2025, Trump announced that a team of US delegates was sent to meet a Russian group in Saudi Arabia in just a few short days. His claims came immediately after a 90-minute phone conversation with Putin, during which Trump said the two leaders discussed how they could bring about an end to the Ukraine war. Both sides appeared buoyant in the wake of that conversation. Trump's decision to speak to Putin broke several years of US policy toward Russia, with the two countries having not spoken since Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia was also keen to stress that it wished to rebuild ties with the US. Kremlin mouthpiece Dmitry Peskov said, "The Russian president invited the US president to visit Moscow and expressed his readiness to receive American officials in Russia in those areas of mutual interest, including, of course, the topic of the Ukrainian settlement." To Trump, that statement indicated that his peace plan was on track. Putin wanted to talk. Trump was ready to make a deal. The meeting took place just a few days later. Trump's team met with Putin's envoys in Saudi Arabia, though there were some issues. Chief among them was that Ukraine didn't receive an invitation. The US was going to try and negotiate peace with Russia without any involvement from the country that Russia invaded. There were also no delegates from Ukraine's many European partners present. The meeting would be between the US and Russia only. The outcome, at least for the US, seemed to be positive. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said an agreement had been drawn up to create a high-level team to support ceasefire talks. That team would also explore opportunities which will emerge from a successful end to the Ukraine conflict. Rubio said that any ceasefire would have to be acceptable to all parties involved, including Russia, Ukraine, and the US. His tone seemed conciliatory. Trump's tone less so. Reacting to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's expressions of disappointment about not being invited to the Saudi meeting, Trump proclaimed that Zelenskyy had 3 years to end the war. "I think I have the power to end this war," he also told reporters from his Mar-a-Lago golf resort in Florida immediately after the meeting. Trump's approach to Ukraine only grew more tumultuous from there. He suggested that Ukraine started the war instead of Russia. Trump also referred to Zelenskyy as a dictator, while claiming that the real reason Ukraine isn't holding elections during wartime is that Zelenskyy knows he's low in the real Ukrainian polls. Trump added in a Truth Social post that Zelenskyy has done a terrible job, his country is shattered, and millions have unnecessarily died. The relationship between Trump and Zelenskyy only seemed to get worse in the weeks that followed. The two had an explosive meeting at the White House in which they constantly argued about the Ukraine war and America's recent decisions. Trump responded to the disrespect he felt during that meeting by suspending American aid to Zelenskyy's embattled country and telling Ukraine's European partners that they could no longer share American intelligence. Even as recently as March 7th, Trump was claiming that Putin was going to be more generous than he has to be in ceasefire talks with Ukraine, while characterizing Zelenskyy as the more difficult of the two leaders to work with. It all seemed to point toward Trump taking a side in the conflict. His messaging suggested Ukraine was to blame, both for supposedly starting the war and for not making a deal with Putin to end it. He ripped into Zelenskyy on multiple occasions, seemingly cementing a position in which the US would try to pressure Ukraine into talks, regardless of whether Ukraine was ready or not. And once those talks happened, Trump claimed, Putin would be more than willing to negotiate for a fair deal. Perhaps those will become famous last words for Trump. Why? Well, on the same day that Trump was claiming that Putin would be generous, Russia's leader stabbed a knife in Trump's back. There would be no generosity in peace or ceasefire talks. There would be no ceasefire at all. On March 7th, Pravda reported that Russia had rejected any possibility of making concessions to Ukraine in any future peace talks. The Kremlin also said that it wouldn't consider the possibility of Western nations, especially those associated with NATO, deploying peacekeeping troops in Ukraine. In short, nothing less than everything that Russia wants would be considered in a supposed negotiation. The New Voice of Ukraine published a similar report, stating that Putin's remarks came a day before Trump claimed he would be generous in peace talks. "We are not going to give in to anyone," Putin declared when speaking at Russia's Defenders of the Fatherland Foundation. He also said Russia will not give up what it believes to be Russian land. That covers the territory Russia has illegally occupied in Ukraine already, along with the rest of the country. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov continued the no-compromise messaging. "There is no room for compromise on the issue," he told reporters when referring to the possibility of a peacekeeping force. European peacekeepers entering Ukraine would be little more than a direct, official, undisguised NATO participation in the war, he added. The comments were a betrayal of everything Trump thought he knew about Russia's approach to a ceasefire. While he touted Putin as generous while calling Zelenskyy difficult, Russia was flat out refusing to accept any sort of compromise or peacekeeping forces on Ukrainian land. Every strategy, beyond complete Ukrainian capitulation that Trump might have had, was suddenly out of his hands. Russia was no longer willing to negotiate. Instead, it was taking advantage of the moves Trump had made to build trust with Putin in the days leading up to the Kremlin ceasefire announcement. Almost immediately after Trump announced the withdrawal of aid from Ukraine, Russia went on the attack. Waves of assaults left 20 Ukrainians dead after Putin intensified his attacks in the Donetsk and Kharkiv regions on March 7th. A day later, Russia fired 2 ballistic missiles into the center of the frontline town of Dobropilya, igniting a fire that engulfed a 5-story building and killed 11 Ukrainians. Then, as rescuers rushed to help, a third strike specifically targeted them. In total, 47 people, including 7 children, were injured during the attacks, according to President Zelenskyy. Trump's trust in Putin was shattered. These aren't the actions of a leader who's even considering a ceasefire. Instead, it looks like Putin lied and manipulated Trump. He made the US president believe he could be trusted. Then, as soon as Trump started taking action to pressure Ukraine into peace talks, Putin struck. Trump responded by suggesting that he was strongly considering large-scale sanctions against Russia as it pounded Ukraine on the battlefield. But those sanctions haven't come yet, with their suggestion coming in the same media briefing where Trump referred to Putin as generous. It's all too little too late. Putin successfully pulled the wool over Trump's eyes to create a situation where he could make even more vicious attacks against Ukraine. The question now is simple: why has Russia rejected the idea of any sort of ceasefire? There are multiple possible answers, with the most obvious being that Russia is only willing to accept a deal that fully conforms to its interests. That's according to the Jamestown Foundation, which points out that its desire for total conformance clashes with Trump's stance on a peace deal. The foundation claims that Trump has promised to help Ukraine regain as much territory as possible in a deal, which doesn't sit well with Russia. Remember Putin's comments about not giving in to anyone. To Russia's leader, the territory Russia occupies in Ukraine is already part of Russia. He won't give a scrap of it over, regardless of what Trump claims. Russia also believes that the ceasefire proposals that exist now do nothing to dispel what it calls the root causes of Putin's supposed special military operation. It claims that stopping the war now would allow Ukraine to turn into a steel porcupine that remains capable of causing severe damage to Russia in the future. The ceasefire certainly wouldn't prompt Ukraine to demilitarize, meaning the country would still present a threat to Putin. Perhaps more importantly, a lack of demilitarization on Ukraine's part means that Putin couldn't invade again after the ceasefire to get what he really wants. Add to all of this that Russia doesn't want Ukraine to have any security guarantees. That may not be a problem from the US perspective. It had already pulled aid from Ukraine once and seems hesitant to commit any of its troops to maintain any ongoing peace in the country. But Europe, that's another problem entirely. While Zelenskyy himself believes that Europe alone can't guarantee Ukraine's safety after a ceasefire, Europe would still be heavily involved. It would likely provide peacekeeping troops, along with delivering weapons to Ukraine and being involved in the country's rebuilding efforts. To Putin, this would amount to Ukraine building ties with a lot of NATO-aligned nations, which represents a threat to his goal of making Russia the dominant power in Europe. So the first reason for Putin's betrayal of Trump is simple. Russia wants more than the US, along with Ukraine and Europe, is willing to offer, and he doesn't want any situation where Ukraine can get stronger post-ceasefire. But there are other reasons for the betrayal. For instance, Ukraine still has leverage, a lot of it. When Zelensky's forces invaded the Kursk region of Russia in August 2024, they did so partially because they knew that holding the Russian territory would be invaluable in peace negotiations later on. Ukraine could trade that Russian territory for at least some of its own, minimizing the amount of Ukrainian land Russia claims as a result. Putin knows this, and he doesn't want to enter ceasefire negotiations in a situation where Ukraine holds any cards. Kursk is a big problem for Russia. When Trump suspended the US aid to Ukraine, Putin used the opportunity to intensify his counteroffensive in Kursk. That intensification forces Ukraine into having to make a choice, according to military analyst Yan Matveyev. The only reason to hold onto the Kursk foothold is to use it as a bargaining chip in future negotiations, Matveyev explains. However, losing a substantial number of experienced troops and advanced equipment in a drawn-out defense could severely weaken Ukraine's military capacity in other regions. Ukraine can try to hold on, sustaining heavier losses in Kursk due to the US equipment and intelligence issues, or it can surrender the territory to pull its troops back so they can defend Ukraine itself. It's a choice Zelenskyy hoped he'd never have to make, and it's a choice that Putin wants to force Ukraine into making. Putin's betrayal of Trump was predicated by Russia convincing the US to cut Ukraine off. That weakened Ukraine in Kursk, allowing Putin to launch stronger attacks. There's almost no chance that Putin would consider a ceasefire until he's either reclaimed the lost Russian territory by force or pushed Ukraine's forces out. Either outcome is fine for Putin. He still takes one of Ukraine's biggest bargaining chips off the table. Russia's frozen assets might also enter Putin's thinking when it comes to Ukraine's leverage. Right now, several countries, including the US and Canada, along with the European Union or EU, collectively hold around $300 billion in Russian central bank assets. Those assets have been frozen since Putin invaded Ukraine. Like Kursk, they represent a key bargaining chip for Ukraine. Zelenskyy could use the unfreezing of those assets to essentially buy back some of the land Putin stole from Ukraine. That's unacceptable to Putin. His refusal to consider a ceasefire may also include his desire to see those assets restored to Russian control. Anything less than that would be unacceptable, meaning the war has to go on. So Putin doesn't want Ukraine to have any leverage if and when Russia enters ceasefire talks. But we also have to consider what Putin does want as another reason for his betrayal. We can boil those desires down into two categories: land and what the land contains. On the pure land front, the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, argues that it's impossible to discuss any sort of peace with Putin. CEPA's reason is simple. Putin's invasion of Ukraine was less about defending Russia and more about restoring an empire. Neither Putin nor his foreign policy advisors have given up on their goal of resurrecting a Tsarist Soviet empire as it existed from the 1780s to the 1980s. The source of today's troubles was not NATO expansion, but Moscow's imperial ambitions, CEPA claimed in an August 2024 article. Not a lot has changed since. CEPA's comments harken back to Putin's own about not giving up any land he believes rightfully belongs to Russia. Understanding those comments means realizing that this comment doesn't apply to Russia as we know it today. It applies to all of the territory Putin believes should be Russian, including Ukraine. To Putin, winning in Ukraine is part of his plan to restore Russia to its supposedly rightful position as one of the world's leading geopolitical powers. It's also important to his legacy. Putin wants to be the man who set Russia back on the path toward having an empire. Oh, and there's also the money to consider. A lot of it. That's where what the land contains comes into play. Ukraine is home to 22 of the 34 minerals that the EU classifies as critical. It's also home to deposits of rare earth elements, or REEs, which collectively are a group of 17 metallic minerals that are used in modern defense, aerospace, renewable, and electronic technologies. All told, Ukraine's critical mineral reserves amount to 5% of the world's entire supply, with rare materials including titanium, lithium, graphite, cerium, and lanthanum all to be found in Ukraine. The BBC digs deeper. It points out that Ukraine has deposits of around 20.9 million tons of graphite, which is a material that ranges in price between $2,000 and $4,000 per ton. At the maximum price, that means Ukraine's graphite deposits amount to a potential $83.6 billion of profit for anybody who can fully exploit them. Ukraine also accounts for 7% of Europe's titanium supplies, about a third of its lithium, and significant deposits of metals including zinc, silver, and copper. The BBC points out that Ukraine has a total of 20,000 mineral deposits, covering 116 types of minerals and REEs. Only 15% of those deposits were being exploited when Putin invaded. Many of those deposits are in Donetsk and the other regions Russia is targeting. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that Putin is as interested in exploiting these minerals to generate money for Russia as he is in rebuilding the Soviet empire. And it's not just money Putin has on his mind. Controlling Ukraine's rare minerals and metals also means Russia gains significant geopolitical influence. Other countries will come to rely on it for materials they need for everything from consumer electronics to weapons manufacturing. Putin wants the billions of dollars that come with taking Ukraine. He may want the influence these untapped deposits deliver to him even more. Agreeing to a ceasefire now, especially one that involves handing back any parts of Donetsk Russia currently occupies, means giving up on a treasure trove and sacrificing Putin's ambition for Russian expansion. And there's one final element to Putin's betrayal of Trump. Russia's leader simply can't afford to look weak to his own people. When rejecting the possibility of a ceasefire, Putin also declared 2025 as the year of the defender of the fatherland. His message was simple. This is the year where Putin keeps all of the promises he made to the Russian people. Since his invasion, Putin has positioned himself as the only man capable of defeating Ukraine and returning it to the fatherland. When Ukraine invaded Kursk, he masked the massive shot to his position as a strongman by repositioning himself as Russia's defender. To Putin, stopping the Ukraine war right now would mean admitting to his country's people that Russia, and Putin by extension, isn't powerful enough to defeat a much smaller nation. Concessions also make Putin look weak to Russia's political elite. That's dangerous for an authoritarian. A perceived lack of the authority that makes Putin's leadership possible opens the door for others to gain the trust of the Russian people. Of course, Putin tries to preemptively deal with this issue. Throughout 2024, he purged Russia's defense ministry, partly to rid it of corruption and partly to eliminate people who might become a threat to his grip on power. Russia's leader has also likely ordered the deaths of several high-profile Russians. The most high-profile of those Russians murdered was Alexei Navalny, a Putin critic and opponent, who died mysteriously in a Siberian jail. It's all about consolidating power for Putin. But even with these measures, he knows that some people will happily try to take advantage of the perceived weakness that comes with a ceasefire to push him out of power. He may not know who those people are, but he's willing to betray Trump to ensure that they don't have the opportunity to cast doubt on his ability to lead Russia. There's only one question left to ask. What comes next now that Putin has not only stabbed Trump in the back, but is actively twisting the knife? In a significant policy shift, the United States and Ukraine have agreed a 30-day ceasefire proposal aimed at de-escalating the ongoing conflict. This development follows recent high-level talks in Saudi Arabia between US and Ukrainian officials. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has expressed support for the ceasefire, stating that it's now up to the United States to persuade Russia to agree to this positive proposal. The proposed ceasefire includes a suspension of naval and aerial activities. While the naval suspension may not significantly impact Russia, considering the Black Sea Fleet has lost around a third of its ships, the aerial suspension poses a substantial challenge for President Vladimir Putin. Russia has been relying on glide bombs launched from aircraft behind the front lines to assault Ukrainian cities. An aerial suspension would limit Russia's capacity to exert pressure on Ukraine. Right now, we don't know Putin's thoughts about this potential partial ceasefire. Russia hasn't commented. Marco Rubio, who led the US delegation in the Saudi Arabia meeting with Ukraine, had previously said that the talks would be key to resolving America's suspension of aid and intelligence sharing. He argued that the suspension came about because the US felt that Ukraine was not committed to any sort of peace process. But just days later, the situation has already changed. The US has officially resumed military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine after Kyiv agreed to back Washington's proposal for a 30-day ceasefire with Russia. Rubio stated that the US would now take the ceasefire proposal to Russia, putting the ball in Moscow's court. Our hope is that the Russians will answer yes as quickly as possible, so we can get to the second phase of this, which is real negotiations. Whether that happens remains to be seen. But when coupled with Putin's betrayal of Trump, Ukraine's move may be enough to convince America's president that it's time to throw his support behind Zelenskyy once again. The question now is, can Trump still push through a ceasefire? Let us know what you think in the comments, along with telling us your thoughts on Putin's betrayal. And remember to subscribe to The Military Show for commentary on the latest developments in the Ukraine war. Now go and check out Europe Will Go to War with Russia if Trump does this, or click this other video instead.